Hi, everybody. Eve Harow on Rejuvenation for the Land of Israel Network. It is July 14th, 2020, the 22nd day of Tammuz, 5780. A very hot day in many spheres in Israel. And I'm really delighted and honored to have with me today Shmuel Rosner, who is, the list of what he does would take up most of the show, but just the short version, author, journalist, thinker, writer, you name it, been around for many, many years. So thank you so much, Shmuel, for joining me today.
It's my pleasure. I also grow tomatoes on the roof.
Oh, really? I love tomatoes.
I really do.
There's nothing like an Israeli tomato.
That's
Seriously,
true.
right?
That's
it's
true.
Just,
That's
yeah.
true. Yeah.
Absolutely. So you write for a lot of Israeli papers. You wrote for Haaretz, for Ma'ariv, as well as New York Times and many papers in English. How did you, Israeli-born with Israeli-born parents, get so involved in the diaspora, in writing actually in very high-level English, by the way, for people outside of the country?
Well, first of all, I'm sure that your listeners would notice my accent, so they'll know I'm an Israeli born. I actually learned how to speak English at a fairly late age and started writing in English only when I was 37 years old. So
2 years ago, right?
Oh, well, 15 years ago,
Okay.
but yeah, it was relatively late in life. I did Israeli journalism in Hebrew for many years, and only fairly late in life I started doing the whole English gig. I came to it fairly late. Now, how did I become involved with the diaspora jury and Israel diaspora relations? I should say it was almost an accident when. I mean, my wife and I were 25, 26 years old. We decided to take a break from our early career and go abroad for a year. We ended up being shlichim in a small Jewish community in Canada, in Kitchener, Ontario, Canada. And we lived there for a year, and this was my first introduction to a North American Jewry.
Mm-hmm.
And we loved the community and we loved the people, and we realized that there is a whole world going on out there that we are not familiar with.
Right.
And this ignited my interest. Then, many years later, I became a chief U.S. correspondent for Horowitz Daily, an Israeli newspaper that you mentioned I wrote for. And when I became an American correspondent, I started writing about the daily affairs of the American Jewish community. I became involved with it as a journalist, and it stuck with me ever since.
So Haaretz, for my listeners who don't know, is not known. Well, most of my listeners, I would say, are conservative, and I think that you also, at least, had been called a conservative. Whether you think of yourself as that or not is actually a question that I would like to get to.
I was called by many names. I was called a conservative, a liberal, but I was called everything. I consider myself to be a centrist, and you're right. Haaretz is much more to the left than where I am.
So, what do you think about the paper? Because certain journalists for Haaretz, let's say like Gidon Levy, are even left-wing Israelis get very upset with some of the things that he writes. Do you think it has an important place in the dialogue, though, Haaretz?
Well, I think it's important that Israel has room for all voices to be heard. I oftentimes do not enjoy the views expressed in Haaretz. I have many misgivings about the way it conducts its business, especially in English. And I'm not sure it's good neither for the paper nor necessarily for Israel. But I think it's important to remember, this is a free country and everybody has the right to have a voice. And if people want to be radical or to vehemently condemn Israel or oppose Israeli policies, that's their right. I don't have to agree with them. I don't have to read the newspaper, but I must let the newspaper have the right to write whatever it wants to write.
Right. Although the problem with Haaretz is that it turns other people who really don't know the context of the whole story, as you and I do, against Israel. And that's been, I think, a dangerous side effect. But speaking of newspapers...
So I would encourage, especially outside observers, not to read just one newspaper from Israel, and to remember that there are many viewpoints and that you have to balance certain viewpoints with the different viewpoints.
So you have been published quite a few times in the New York Times, and there has been a lot of noise in the New York Times about perhaps not allowing their writers to express their opinions as you just mentioned, is important for it to happen in Israel. So do you think that rule that applies here in Israel, and that we're going to fight for the right of anybody to say what they want to say, even if we vehemently disagree with what they have to say? Do you think they're losing that in the United States or outside of Israel a bit?
Look, when I'm looking at the United States, I must also remember that I'm an outside observer. I do not live in the United States currently. I'm quite familiar with the scene. I lived in the Washington area for a number of years, and I'm a keen reader of American history and American journals. And so I know quite a lot about the states, but for me to pass judgment on the United States and to say, these are the trends, and I'm certain that it's going to a bad place, I think that would be an overstatement. Am I happy with everything that's been going on in the United States? No, I'm not happy with everything. I think there is a very strong sense of partisanship in the United States today, and I think that people are living in their silos and aren't always willing to consider views of the other side. This is true for conservatives and for liberals. I see it more on the liberal side in recent days, but we should remember that this is also true for conservatives. The conservatives aren't always willing to consider the viewpoints of liberals as well. I don't think Israel is at the same place. I think in Israel we are still we still have a much more tolerant discourse. It gets angry. We sometimes, we get into shouting matches, and we don't always listen carefully to other people's views. But I think the atmosphere here, because Israel is smaller and more family-like in many ways, more close-knit society, I think the situation here is still somewhat different. And on this issue, I hope Israel remains more like Israel and less becomes more like the United States.
And how about Europe? What do you feel about what's happening there?
To be honest, my familiarity with Europe is really not, I don't feel that there is real depth to it. So passing judgment on what's going on in Europe is not for me. When I look at Europeans and the way they speak about Israel, I'm not happy. I think that Europeans tend to have a very shallow view of what's going on here. But on things other than Israel, I really can't say anything of any significance about Europe.
Are you concerned about the anti-Semitism that seems to be rising, or maybe is just kind of being more uncovered these days in Europe and in the United States?
No, I think it's rising, and I think it's rising among other reasons because of the time that passed since the World War II and the Holocaust. I think what happened from 1945 up until a few years ago was some kind of a timeout. The Jews, got a timeout from rabid anti-Semitism because of the very strong impression of the Holocaust in the Western minds. And I think this memory is waning, and that's one of the reasons we see anti-Semitism becoming again something that people can talk about out in the open without feeling ashamed. There were always anti-Semitic sentiments among, Westerners and in other countries. But I think for a time it was almost illegitimate to have anti-Semitic views and express them as if this is something that is, just a common thing that people can have. And this illegitimacy of anti-Semitism is waning.
Right.
And I think that's a problematic and worrying process.
What do you think about the Polish elections that they just had? It's interesting because this, I think, the first election since the pandemic, right? I don't know if that makes a difference, but do you think that it does? Do you think that the situation that the world is in now, where everybody is also, because of the lack of travel, we talked about an echo chamber before, you think there's more of that, like within different countries, maybe a little more nationalism in a negative sense, because people are not being exposed as much as they might have been to other cultures in the last few months? I'm just wondering, if these travel restrictions, I love to travel, I know that you go around, you think it's going to have an effect on the politics as well?
Well, I'm sure it's having an effect, but I think the more dramatic effect of the pandemic is the sense of uncertainty that people have. Uncertainty combined with fear or apprehension of what the future holds. This is true both for the health situation, but maybe even more so for the economic situation. And we know that in times of uncertainty, there is a tendency to look for radical ideas, for quick solutions. Populist ideas are becoming more common and more acceptable to people. We see this in the United States for sure. We see it in some ways in Israel and in other countries as well. So this atmosphere of uncertainty and of looking for quick fixes for complicated problems, that's a dangerous situation, and it can lead to all kinds of problems that we might see in the near future all around the world.
So I was speaking to my husband this morning, he's a physician, he's a primary care physician, and
it's good that you speak with one another.
Yes, that's already a good thing. But yeah, he makes me coffee, so that buys a lot that I have with my two Majul dates. That's my breakfast every morning. But he doesn't see how we're going to avoid another lockdown with the numbers rising. But the question is, and as somebody who is also very excited that the pools are opening, and I'm hoping that they stay open long enough for me to at least get there once or twice in the coming week. I know that's a very selfish comment to make. The question is then what happens long term? We talk about this is going to be a long-term situation, and it seems like, let's just talk as Israelis, because really we're not that familiar with what's happening in other countries with our Israeli government. So let's say we have a lockdown now for 10 days, which is what they're talking about. Maybe they're saying 10 days because the public will scream and yell if it's longer than 10 days, so they'll keep extending it. Then what happens? So we lock down for 10 days, the numbers maybe go down a little bit, and then we don't reopen, we reopen. Where do you see this going? If you were in charge of the COVID cabinet, okay, which I would probably like if you were, because I'm not crazy about who is in charge, what would you say now to the Israeli public, and where would you go? I know it's an unfair question. You're not an economist, and you're not a politician, but you have thoughts. You think all the time. Poor you. But where would you take this now?
Look, we are holding this conversation at a very problematic time for Israel, and it's very clear that Israel, we had two phases of dealing with the plague. We started well. The government handled the early stages of the pandemic with a sense of responsibility. With hands on the wheel, and not everything was perfect. You cannot expect everything to be perfect when so many things are uncertain and unknown, but the government did well in handling the situation for a while. And then everything just went away without, I'm not even sure why. For some reason, the government lost control of the situation.
Right.
There was public pressure. We went back to normalcy very quick without much consideration of the possible implication of such things. And we lost control. And I think that we are now this week at a situation when the government is trying to regain control of the situation, and it's very difficult. It's difficult not necessarily because the measures are difficult to come up with. It is difficult because there's no public trust, because the public no longer trusts the government, and everybody's certain that everybody else is trying to trick him. You see it within the government. There's no trust between the different factions within the government, so they are blocking. Just yesterday, a head of a committee, a member of Likud, defied her own prime minister so that swimming pools,
apropos,
and I understand that you are pleased with the decision. I'm not pleased with it because I don't understand the rationale. But a Knesset committee headed
I'll
by
agree with
Likud,
you there. I'm being very selfish. I admit it.
they defied the prime minister and decided to do something that the government does not want them to do. Now, we see it everywhere. When synagogues are closed, then you see Haredi politicians shouting, why synagogues are closed and demonstrations in Tel Aviv are still going on. And when you not allow bars or restaurants to open, then people ask, well, why not restaurants? But we do have wedding halls. So everybody's highly suspicious of everybody else's motivations, and everybody's certain that the government is working not to make things better, but to appease public opinion or special interest groups, or people with power or people with money, and this is a dangerous situation. We know the famous expression from the Book of Judges. In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did as he pleases. It feels in some sense that this is what's going on in Israel today, and I want our king, not in the undemocratic sense, in the democratic modern sense, but we need our king to restore its ability to project power and restore order. And until it's done, I can't tell you what the future holds. It's a troubling and dangerous situation.
So you have 4 children, correct?
I have 4.
Are they out and about? I assume they're not little teenagers?
Well, one of them is on a cruise ship near the shores of Brazil for the last 4 or 5 months. He's stuck there. He cannot get off the ship. He went there to be a security guard, and I hope he's coming back soon. One of them is a soldier. Another one will become a soldier in about a month. So he's just graduated from high school, and he's going into the military. And I have a younger daughter, a 13-year-old daughter. So
the family princess, she'll still be with you. Wow, off the coast
of Brazil. The princess or the witch, depends on what day and who you ask.
She's 13?
She's 13.
Oh, just wait. I'm laughing, but with great sympathy, having raised 4 daughters of my own. So it's fine. You'll be fine. You might want to start drinking now, though. Just a suggestion.
Right.
Get some things online. But your son, who's off the coast of Brazil, that's crazy. I mean, Brazil also has been one of the hot spots.
Yeah, well, he's on a ship, and they're fairly, they're secluded. No one is coming on.
Wow.
On board or going off board, so they're stuck there. There's no pandemic on the ship, but he's stuck there.
But the Israeli government made a great effort to bring Israelis back from all over the world. Is that a possibility, or he
Oh
can't?
no, he'll
He
come
could
back.
if he wants to.
He's fine. He's fine.
Uh-huh.
I have no real worries about him. He's just there, and he's j- this is just one of these many crazy things that are happening around the world because of the pandemic. Each person has his or her own crazy
That's
story to
right.
tell. So, and this is just one of them.
This is your family's crazy story.
Exactly.
Okay. But you mentioned you have one soldier and another soon-to-be soldier in the August draft. So what do you think about the bigger picture that's happening here in the Middle East? We're talking about opening pools, and we've got COVID, and we've all the little, not so little, but the more internal concerns. But it doesn't remove us from the neighborhood that we're in here in the Middle
Right.
East. And a lot of the people around us aren't, they're still doing whatever nefarious things our neighbors do. So what are you thinking about Iran and Syria? And, a lot of this is off the front pages because everyone's concerned with other things, but it's still there. So what are your thoughts about, especially because you've got a lot of skin in the game, as they say, with 2 kids in the army. This is not some theoretical thing for you.
Well,
at all.
I have skin in the game as someone who lives here, raises,
for sure.
have a family here. I have my parents here. I have my
Mhm.
brothers and sister here, and their families. And I have
Mhm.
friends and my country.
Right.
What do I think about the Middle East? In one sentence, there's nothing good going on in the Middle East right now. All trends that we see are not positive trends. Maybe a few threads of positivity. You can see the growing coordination and even cooperation between Israel and some Arab states to confront Iran and its allies. So this is
Mhm.
one positive trend. You might think that the pandemic is doing something good in taking the minds of some governments off the bad things and onto having to deal with their domestic situation. But other than that, the Middle East is still the Middle East. There is an ongoing battle within the Middle East between highly radical governments and regimes and those who prefer to have a sense of stability for the people who live here. And I think that this clash between revolutionary radicalism versus stability. I'm not saying democracy. I'm not saying it's not about democracy or liberalism or Western ideas. It's just this very simple thing of revolution versus stability. This is the clash that we've seen for many years in the Middle East, and it is still going on. And I don't think it's disappearing anytime soon. So you're asking me what Israel has to do. The
Mhm.
simple answer is we have to be very strong. We have to be strong enough to know that we can defeat any potential foe because people are coming to get us, and we need to stand firm and make sure that they can do such thing.
So based on that, what is your feeling about if it's going to even happen? And now it looks like it's really been shelved, applying Israel's sovereignty under Judea and Samaria, versions of the plan of the century, the Trump plan, lots of different names out there. You think it's something that we shouldn't be dealing with now, that it should be put away for a bit until things calm down, or we should make a statement, we should shake it up a little bit, given what else is happening here in the Middle East and the fact that the PA is not hasn't exactly proven to be a peace partner the way so many people hoped decades ago.
So I think the discussion about annexation really mixes two things that we don't have to mix. One thing is the issue of Israeli sovereignty in parts of Judea and Samaria, what people call the West Bank. It's clear that many of the areas in this territory are now and are going to remain under Israeli jurisdiction for forever.
Mm-hmm.
I don't see any situation, any possibility that Israel will ever give up on Gush Etzion or on Ma'ale Adumim, what we call the settlement blocks.
Mm-hmm.
I don't see any situation, at least not in the many, many years to come, that Israel is going to give up on the Jordan Valley as its security border. So this is one thing, and in this sense, annexation is, just a word, just a symbolic, it's a symbolic move to say publicly what we already know. These areas are going to remain under Israeli jurisdiction and sovereignty. Now, do we have to make this symbolic move right now? That's a whole different debate. And the two sides basically, it's a close call. It's a close call. You can say we have an opportunity because of the Trump administration, and it might not be there in a few months. So let's just make the move and hope for the best. And the other side would say, well, why now? The Judea and Samaria aren't going anywhere. Israel is not going anywhere. We can do it now, or we can do it 10 years down the road, and it doesn't really matter. So I think most of all, the discussion about annexation is not that important. It's
really
not that important. It's, again, if anyone thinks that Israel is going to give up or withdraw from these parts of the West Bank that we are speaking about, that person is delusional. It's not happening. On the other hand, if anyone thinks that if we don't do it now, we can do it later, well, I'll ask, why not? Why now? What's the urgency? We are already there. We already have control over this territory. So again, I understand both sides of this situation, and I'm not highly emotional about it in any way. I don't think it matters that much.
Now I understand why you describe yourself as a centrist, because that's pretty much exactly what that would convey. So it's getting off of politics and all of that. I really want to talk about a book that you published not long ago on a topic that absolutely fascinates me as someone who's lived here for many decades and raised children here who are all over the place when it comes to their Judaism. And Israel Judaism, Portrait of a Cultural Revolution. So perhaps tell my listeners a little bit about this book and something that those of us who live in Israel are very aware of, and people who don't are not as aware of as they should be, which is also why they should read the book. I'll just plug that for a second in there.
Right.
But please tell us a little bit.
Yeah, they can get it on Amazon, the English, both the Hebrew and the English version of it, and they can order it in paper or in a digital format. So that's, and I should also say that I'm the co-author of the book. I wrote it together with Israel's leading pollster, mathematician, Professor Camil Fuchs from Tel Aviv University. And the book is not based on our important and interesting thoughts. It is based on data. We gathered a lot of data about the way Israelis think and behave, Israeli Jews, the way they think and behave. And we came up with special, hopefully different way to describe the cultural aspect of Israeli life. What we basically argue in this book, that in 70 years, Israel revolutionized the idea of what it means to be Jewish. How does one go about being Jewish? How the way we feel about being Jewish, the way we celebrate our Jewishness. Judaism in Israel is different than any Judaism that we are familiar with anywhere else or at any different time. It's really a new thing, and that's why we don't call it Judaism, we call it Israeli Judaism, as if it's one word, because Israeli Judaism is different. And just to highlight a few of the differences, first of all, Israeli Judaism is very national. in sense, Judaism in Israel is not a religion. It's a sense of belonging to a nation, much more than it is a religion. Of course, people here, there are religious people in Israel who do all kinds of religious things as part of their belonging to the Jewish nation. But even for the half of Israeli Jews who are not religious, who are secular Israelis, Judaism is pretty much a way of life, and they view it as an expression of their nationality. For them, lighting candles in Hanukkah and raising the flag on Yom Ha'atzmaut, Independence Day, these are two aspects of Judaism, and they're not essentially different. The fact that Hanukkah is mentioned in the Talmud and that Independence Day is a modern creation of the state doesn't make much of a difference. So the national aspect of it is one thing that is worth mentioning. And the other aspect I would mention is, it is almost a cliche to say that being Jewish is difficult. It's a struggle. We are a struggling minority, and we have to invest a lot of effort in being Jewish. If you live, as I did for a few years, in a small Jewish community somewhere, you have to struggle to find kosher food. You have to look for a synagogue. You have to belong to a community. You have to pay your dues. You have to do all kinds. You have to be very active to remain a part of the Jewish community, of the Jewish people. One of the things that Israel revolutionized is that it made Judaism the easy choice.
The default mode, in a way.
Exactly.
Yeah.
A few weeks ago, well, it was a few months ago, before the pandemic, there was a group of Jewish executives from the Philadelphia area who came here, and they asked me to brief them on the findings that we have in the book. And, I gave them all kinds of statistics about Israeli Jews, what we do, what we celebrate, what we do not celebrate. And ultimately, at the Q&A session, one of them asked me, so what is Judaism in Israel? And my response was, Judaism is what Israelis call life. This is what we do. We breathe Judaism. It's part of our daily routine. We live by the Jewish calendar. We celebrate by the Jewish calendar. We don't have to invest any special effort in being Jewish. And in this way, Israel is really different than any other Jewish environment in history. Well, maybe in the days of the first temple, it was the same. We don't really know. But for the last 2,000 years, there was never a Jewish community in which it was so easy and comfortable to be Jewish, to live Jewishly. And it's not at all the same in other Jewish communities in the world. So just understanding this and understanding the way Israeli Judaism works and ticks, I think is very important, both for Israelis and for Jews around the world, because some of the difficulties that we have in the so-called, dialogue between Jews in Israel and Jews in other communities is lack of understanding. Jews in Israel do not understand the way Jews elsewhere live, and Jews in other countries, the United States or Australia or Canada or Britain, do not understand why Israel is so different. They don't understand that we say Jewish or Judaism as if we all agree on what this is. But the fact of the matter is that Judaism in Israel is Israeli Judaism. And Judaism in other places is not Israeli Judaism. It is some other kind of, some other stream of Judaism. And these are very different things.
But do you think that that's also part of the reason why there's now a drift? It seems that, and I grew up in the United States. So for me, I'm like, just getting back to the swimming pool analogy, I'm swimming in Judaism here. That's the way it is. And for me, and I appreciate it tremendously because I know what it's like to not have that. But it seems that many Jews outside of Israel, except for the pockets of Orthodox Jews who really are keeping the rituals as strictly as they can and making the effort to send their kids to day school and to belong to the synagogue, and it's costing them a lot of money as well. And I don't even know if that's sustainable. That's a whole other conversation. But other Jews are seeing their Judaism as being validated by liberal beliefs, okay, to be a good person, to care about others, which is all part of Judaism, to respect others. That's how they're manifesting their Judaism now. And the nationalistic aspect of Israeli Judaism, which you mentioned, is perhaps pushing them away from Israel because nationalism or patriotism is seen as somewhat of a dirty word, or even what you mentioned a few minutes ago, being strong. Right? Because being strong infers that there's an enemy out there that you have to protect yourself from. And all of these fly in the face of where I think diaspora Judaism is trending. So while you and I living here, and I'm going to assume that you see this as a positive thing, Israeli Judaism.
I do.
Perhaps there's a price to be paid vis-a-vis our co-religionists who are not in Israel. So what do you think about that?
Well, I don't think about it as a price. I think about it as a challenge. It is a challenge. The fact that what we have in Israel is a Jew-Israeli culture. That's what we call it in the book. We have a majority Jew-Israeli culture. It creates two kinds of challenges. It creates a challenge vis-a-vis non-Jews who live in Israel, because we have a Jewish majority country, but there is a 20 to 25% minority in Israel who are not Jewish, and we need to live alongside this population and let them feel as if they are part of this country, and let them be full-fledged citizens who participate in the culture and the life of this country. So that's one challenge when you have a Jew-Israeli culture and non-Jewish minority. And it also creates a challenge with non-Israeli Jews, because we have a Jew-Israeli Judaism and they have a non-Jew-Israeli Judaism, and there's a gap here that we need to find a way to bridge, and it's difficult. And I'm not sure that we always go about it in the right way. I think we tend to focus too much on where we disagree. We look for solutions where we can't find them. We immediately go and talk about, Trump versus Obama, Netanyahu versus, all these problems that we cannot resolve, rather than try and look for the things on which we agree, and to look for the common things that we can share as part of our being one group, one people. We are one people. That's the way it is. This is our story. Our story begins with the family of Jacob going down to Egypt. It's a family becoming a tribe, becoming a people, moving out of Egypt as a people, and only then receiving the Torah. So we are a people first and a religion second. And those who do not remember this are going to probably drift away from our culture, because modernity is a great challenge for all religions, including the Jewish religion. And one of the strengths that we have, one of the ways in which we can meet this challenge head on and beat it, is because we are not just a religion. We are much more than a religion. We have the Jewish People Policy Institute, for which, at which I work as a senior fellow. We call it the Jewish civilization.
Interesting.
It encompasses, we have the sense of peoplehood and culture and shared history and text, and the religious aspect of it, of course, that's also very important. All of these aspects are important, and keeping them all is one of the ways for us to beat the challenge of globalization, modernity, universalism, and all the other things that makes it more difficult to be Jewish in this world.
So in normal days, when I function as a tour guide and people come here, both Jews and Christians that I guide, and also there's an organization, Momentum, that comes and brings Jewish women here to kind of really get to understand their Judaism in a different way. And one of the things that I say to them is there's a discrepancy in the translation. When you talk about a secular Israeli, so if I describe a secular Israeli to someone who doesn't live in Israel, and I describe it, and I believe that this is a good description, someone who speaks fluent Hebrew, who has Friday night dinner with their family virtually every single week, who has a Seder on Passover, probably fasts on Yom Kippur, and maybe even believes in a higher power. All right, there's something out there. Now that describes a secular Israeli, which to many people would mean not religious. But if you describe someone outside of Israel as that, you're probably talking hardcore conservative. And I'm not even sure if we're there because of the Hebrew, because one of the things that I find is really tragic is the lack of Hebrew knowledge. And Micha Goodman talks about this extensively, is not knowing Hebrew really disconnects people from our texts and from even with all the translations. So, to say that I understand what you're saying about Israel being a very Jewish country, and I think that people don't realize that even Israelis who consider themselves not religious are very, very Jewish in all the parameters that I just described. So the question is, what happens to Israelis who leave Israel? And we see this, and I know from myself and from relatives that I have, once you leave Israel, once you leave this little bubble of Jewish civilization, if you will, or Jewish culture, then is there anything, if you're not observant in the sense of, let's say, kashrut, or keeping Shabbat, or something that holds you into a Jewish community, do you think that there's really a chance, and we see it from some of the Israelis who have left Israel, to drift away from that? Is it enough to feel culturally Jew-Israeli, as you put it?
No, the Jew-Israeli Judaism works in Israel.
Yeah.
This is a culture connected to a certain place with its certain rules and certain, this is a majority culture. If you move out of Israel and into a place in which the Jews are a minority, you cannot practice your Judaism as a majority culture.
Right.
And you must, then you must decide. You can become more religiously observant, or you can, become part of the community, or you can drift away. You cannot retain your sense of belonging in the same way, observing Jew-Israeli Judaism when you live in Palo Alto, California,
right,
or in Chicago, or in whatever, or in Paris, France. This works here because it depends. It works in Israel because Israel works for it, because of the calendar, because of the school system, because of the military service, because of workplaces, because of the way we, because of television.
And Hebrew.
And of course,
we're speaking in Hebrew.
Yes. Hebrew is a very important component of it. But in the book, in Israeli Judaism, in the book, we give the example of the holiday of Shavuot. Okay, it's a minor one-day holiday. If you live abroad, if you live, I don't know, in Pensacola, Florida, Shavuot can come and go, and you will not even notice it.
Yeah.
If you live in Israel 2 weeks before Shavuot, whenever you watch TV, you will have to watch, ads for
cheesecake.
Yeah, and cheese products. Yeah. And if you go to the supermarket, there are sales for cheese products, etc. It is something that you're surrounded, even without investing any effort in it, without even thinking about it, you are surrounded by Jewish culture. And that's why it's so easy, and that's why it works only here and not elsewhere.
Do you see a wave of aliyah because of a combination of factors, the pandemic or the anti-Semitism that's rising or an economic situation that'll start getting shakier for people outside the country. Do you see that we're going to suddenly get an influx of Jews coming in?
I think more Jews will be coming in the coming years, but it depends a lot on the economic situation, both in other countries and in Israel. The most important driver of immigration, this is not just true for aliyah. Most people who immigrate do it for economic reasons first, and then for all other reasons. So first, we need Israel to be a thriving, economically successful country, to be considered a good home, a good place to live in. If Israel becomes, or even if Israel remains or becomes even more so such place, then Jews will be tempted to come here because, Israel really, it's a wonderful place.
Yeah.
We have our
really
challenges, but I live in Tel Aviv. I love it. It's a great place. So if the economic situation here is solid, and if Israel is secure and safe, and of course, if the situation in other places is not as secure or as safe or as economically successful, then people will be coming here. If things are reversed, then people will be leaving Israel rather than staying in Israel. But I'll give you just one statistic. I know our conversation is coming to an end. So this is a statistic I really love because it really captures in one number the essence of Israel's success. Okay? So I'll just take you back exactly 100 years ago, or maybe
give or take.
Yeah, give or take. 1918, okay, the end of World War I. 100 years ago. Do you know how many Jews lived in what was then Palestine, in this territory?
500,000 maybe?
I'll give you the right answer is 60,000. End of World War I, 60,000 Jews. 30 years later, Israel was born, 1948.
With 600,000.
600,000.
Right.
100 years later, 2018, that's 2 years ago, we passed the mark of 6 million Jews living in Israel.
Yeah.
So that's 100 times more Jews within 100 years, from 60,000 to 6 million in 100 years. If anyone thinks that Israel is not a dramatic, successful, amazing enterprise, just look at this number.
Right.
From 60,000 to 6 million in 100 years.
It's an extraordinary number. It really is. And a very young and vibrant population. You have 4 children. I have 7. The family, the strength of the family here, which is really the core, I think, of any society, is enormous. The love that we have. I mean, you mentioned your parents. When I spoke about your children in the Army, your boys in the Army, and you said, okay, so my boys are in the Army, but this is my country. My parents are here. My siblings are here. It's a very different sense of the membranes are very different here when it comes to that. And I don't know if there's another place in the world right now that has that kind of vibrancy. And I would even say optimism. And that's how I want to end this talk, with that optimism, because very much the news, very, gloom and doom and COVID and the numbers are rising. The economy.
It's a weird time to talk, to be optimistic, but it's better to be optimistic.
And the bottom line is that we're still having babies, and the most important thing is our children and the society, and we still see a very bright future here. With all that's happening, I don't see a wave of yerida, the opposite of aliyah, to anywhere. Individuals maybe, but certainly it's not a conversation here now that people are running to New Zealand.
No, the old joke, in the early days of the state, they had this joke that the last one leaving
turn off
just
the lights.
Turn off the lights.
Yeah,
we are a country of 9 million people, more than 6.5 million Jews. No one is going to turn off the lights here.
No one's going to turn off the lights. And I think there is also slowly a wave of appreciation from the minorities here in Israel, even though they're not swimming in the Judaism because they're Muslim and Christian or whatever it is. But there's still an appreciation for this country and an understanding that it's a heck of a lot better than virtually any other place. And I think
we have
that,
a whole other conversation about that.
Totally.
It's a very interesting topic as well.
Yes. And go good. So I'll have you back because I also want to talk about the Russians who came, who technically are not Jewish, but feel very Israeli, and the rabbinate. And so we're going to book another conversation because I was making notes and there's still so many things that I'd like to talk to you about.
With pleasure.
Okay, Shmuel Rosner, thank you so much for joining me here today on Rejuvenation on the Land of Israel Network. Where can people reach you if they want to follow you now or get your books? How do they go about finding you?
At Rosner's Domain on Twitter. Again, I would urge him to go and look at Israeli Judaism, Portrait of a Cultural Revolution, available on Amazon.
Okay, fantastic. All right, so I'd like to thank Tabitha and Ben for putting out this show. And all of you, you can also reach me, if you'd like to, Eve, at thelandofisrael.com. So take care, everyone. Be safe and healthy and have a wonderful week. And we'll be back. Eve Harow on Rejuvenation. Take care, everybody. Goodbye for now.
Tune in to Israel Uncensored with Josh Haston for a very special interview with Ashagir Araro, founder of the Ethiopian Israeli Heritage Center in Tel Aviv.
I'm proud Zionist because I understand I'm the first generation Ethiopian Jew who in my family that is able to live free as Jews. And we cannot take it for granted and we have to fight for it.
That's Israel Uncensored with Josh